Morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you might be catching us. Welcome to another amazing installment of the Richard Watkins Podcast. Before we go any further, we got to remind you that the Richard Watkins Podcast is a proud production of the Science Policy Action Network. Find out more about the Science Policy Action Network at span-inc.org. That is span-inc.org. Now, with that out of the way, let's get the proceedings proceeding because we've got an amazing subject in store for you today. It's, in fact, one of my favorite subjects. We've talked about it before, but we cannot talk about it enough. And that is the subject of viruses. Yeah. Those obligate intracellular parasites that everybody talks about from here to there and everywhere. But they don't quite talk about them enough. I hear misconceptions constantly that is pervasive and nobody corrects it. And so um, let's have a conversation about these things. Now, in general, when I talk to folks, most people who know that I'm a scientist don't actually know what type of science that I am classically trained in. And so I'm classically trained in the general subject of microbiology and immunology. So, microbiology is like life that is microscopic, life that exists that you have to use a microscope to see it. By and large, it generally refers to bacteria, right? So that is microbiology. Now, immunology, on the other hand, is your body's defense system, right? It it is the study of all of the components of your body that keep you from getting sick. And if you get sick, it allows you to recover and get better. So that is your immune system. And we are going to talk on another episode about the immune system, but not today. Today, we are going to talk about viruses. Now, I have opportunities to talk to folks all over the place, children, old folks, people right in the middle. And oftentimes they've got a lot of misconceptions about what things are, right? So, what I usually tell people is hey, microbiology is basically the study of germs. And when folks say germs, often they just mean anything you can't see that will make you sick. Now, that falls generally into two categories, right? That falls into one category being bacteria and the other category being viruses. We've talked about these before, and so please revisit some of our older episodes in which we talked a little bit more about what viruses are, and we'll talk about bacteria as well. But today we want to talk specifically about viruses. Now, what makes a virus different from bacteria is bacteria are oftentimes looked at as being alive, right? And we will discuss life. I know we've had an episode about what is death, and we touched on the concept of what is life on that episode. But just for the sake of this conversation, bacteria are looked at as being alive because they fit into the categories required for, I guess, being alive. Whereas viruses are on the fence, right? Now, most researchers, biologists, virologists, I myself am a virologist. So, though my PhD came from a department of microbiology and immunology, I think right back there it says microbiology and immunology. I specifically focused on viruses. And what makes viruses unique is that they really can't do anything on their own. They have no forms of locomotion. They are really dependent on their environment to move them about, move them around. So that's why when you might hear a virus described as being airborne, that means that it travels through the air. Now, it doesn't fly, it doesn't swim through the air. It is usually attached to debris, particles, droplets, things that are small and aerosolized that can cover long distances through the air. Now, a lot of times we don't actually appreciate just how far very small things travel in the air, but they travel a great distance. They are so light that currents, air currents, just take them great distances. And you don't necessarily even have to feel a breeze for an air current to be going. And so the viruses are attached to debris or droplets, like small particles of moisture that then carry the virus. And if it lands on your hand or your nose, and it gets in your body that way. Now, not all viruses utilize airborne systems of going from one host to another. When I say host, that's another thing that makes a virus unique, is that it requires a host to make more of itself. Again, these are things that we've talked about before, but I think it's important to just remind you all exactly what we're talking about. And so it needs a host. A virus cannot do a lot of things on its own, right? It can't make more of itself. Right now, that is something that is very important for every living organism. It's called reproduction, the ability of an organism to make more of itself, right? Humans do reproduction obviously through sexual intercourse, giving birth to live babies and raising them into adults. We see the same things in many animals, whether they hatch eggs, live birth, what have you, right? Even plants um, uh, engage in reproduction and the creation of offspring, seeds, saplings. It's the same thing, but a virus is very different. It doesn't do any of that on its own. It requires a host, and it requires a host cell to then make more of itself. Now, one of the things that make viruses really cool is that often they require specific hosts. Now, there are many viruses that infect different types of hosts, right? There are viruses that exist in the animals, and then that virus is able to jump if given the opportunity from animals to people. This happens a lot with a lot of different viruses, but there are some viruses that can only infect a certain organism, and they have evolutionarily specialized to infect and reproduce, and or not reproduce, replicate in that host. And so that's also really important to know. And oftentimes, it chooses the method of infection that just best suits it it's the host cells that it is looking for, and it's a lot of evolutionary pressure that produces the viruses that you are going to deal with, right? So there are also viruses that spread via the fecal oral route. So that means excrement, that means feces, that means poop. That's what that means. And if poop is able to get into your mouth, into your body, uh, that is the means at which this virus is able to infect multiple hosts. Now, if it sounds disgusting, it is because it is disgusting. And one of the things that I just would like to impress upon you is we are not saying that people who are infected by viruses that jump from one host to another via the fecal oral route are simply walking around eating poop all the time. That is not I'm saying. What I'm saying is you just do not realize just how many poop particles are just moving about you, right? And also, many of these viruses are very resistant to standard cleaning practices. If a surface comes into contact with fecal particles and you are not using the appropriate cleaning process, the viruses that are on or attached to those fecal particles, even if you move the fecal particles, may still be present on the surface. And then if you touch it, touch your mouth, then you can become infected. So it's very important to really appreciate viruses because an understanding of them will put you in a better position to protect yourself or protect the ones that you love, right? So oftentimes disinfectants, bleach is an excellent cleaning product when dealing with viruses that are transmitted via fecal oral. Now, we're going to get into a lot of this stuff in later episodes, but it has a lot to do with whether or not that virus is enveloped or non enveloped. But we are not going to get into that today, but just for your information, right? That is for you to consider, right? So know what you're dealing with and know how to properly protect yourself and clean, right? Now, you've got viruses that are transmitted via blood or other bodily fluids. And this is the type of viruses that I worked with, right? So you've got viruses that are transmitted through bodily fluids and certain bodily fluids. Now, the virus that I worked on was called HIV. HIV is probably the most well known virus to have ever existed. Now, I want to break some things down as far as nomenclature that people oftentimes get confused, right? And I hear it all the time. And most of the time in passing, I address it. But there are not enough people who know about these things to really correct the type of language. All right. So, for example, the virus known as influenza A, that virus can cause the flu, right? So people say the flu virus, but generally speaking, that virus has a name and it's called influenza, right? So that's another important part. Here's another thing, right? SARS CoV 2 or SARS or severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, so SARS CoV 2, that is the virus that causes COVID. COVID is a disease, coronavirus disease. Okay. So when somebody says, I caught COVID, they're not actually speaking correctly. And that's really important because a lot of people might throw up their hands and say, well, I said what I said and you know what I meant. It's important that you say things correctly. And if you don't know something, try to seek more information. There's nothing wrong with that. One of the biggest problems with that mix up is that when people, for instance, are being vaccinated. And that vaccine is to prevent COVID. Now, somebody takes the vaccine, then they get tested for the presence of antibodies from the virus or just the detection of parts of the virus SARS CoV 2. And then they test positive, and then they think to themselves, wait, I thought that I wasn't supposed to get COVID. Time passes, they never actually get sick. Well, they were infected by the virus, but their immune system was able to react in a way that prevented them from getting the disease COVID. It prevented them from getting sick or really sick. And so that misunderstanding and that continuous misuse of phrases and terminology leads to a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions regarding what you were talking about. Another one, and this is huge for what I research, is HIV. So, HIV is human immunodeficiency virus. The V stands for virus, right? And we'll go into what makes this virus so amazingly difficult to deal with. And we'll talk about why it has been such a big public health concern. So, HIV, again, stands for human immunodeficiency virus. Now, a lot of times, many people who I interacted with, and if you are listening and you are one of these people, it is okay, right? I don't know everything, and there's things that I know today that I did not know yesterday. So it is all good. Bring your ignorance. Here we have a safe place for you to be as ignorant as you want to be and come here and get informed. Okay. So, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, is the name of the virus. Now, a lot of people hear a term that is very closely associated with the virus, and that is AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Okay, so the virus infection leads to AIDS in some cases, in most cases, but in some cases. And I'll talk a little bit about why I say not in all cases, right? What AIDS is the presence of different infections that would normally not be seen in a healthy individual. And in this situation, I'm talking about an individual with a healthy immune system. Remember, the immune system is what keeps you safe and what keeps you protected from germs. And remember, germs, bacteria, viruses, generally speaking. Okay. So that's what keeps you safe and protected from those things. Now, HIV is so incredibly difficult to deal with for a wide variety of reasons, and I'm going to touch on them now. First, HIV can be transmitted in a wide variety of ways, right? First, HIV can be transmitted from mother to child via breast milk. Also, HIV can be transmitted from mother to child during childbirth, right? So those are two very difficult mechanisms for dealing with HIV, right? And then I'll talk about what makes it even more complicated. Now, it has been shown that breast milk itself has some protective qualities in regards to preventing HIV infection, but individuals can become infected. Babies can become infected with HIV contaminated breast milk, right? So the mother has HIV. HIV is then found in that mother's breast milk. When that mother breastfeeds, that child can become HIV positive. HIV can also be transmitted via blood, right? So if HIV infected blood or blood that contains HIV, um, if you are exposed to that and that gets your bloodstream in whatever way it can, that also results in infection because you find HIV in the blood of HIV infected patients. And so, if for one reason or another, your blood comes into contact with blood from an HIV infected person and that, you know, that infects you that way, then that is a way that you can be, or that is a way that HIV is transmitted, right? This is particularly a problem in regard to intravenous injections, right? So you have a needle that goes into a vein into your bloodstream. And if that needle has been used or it has virus on it, then that virus can be introduced into your bloodstream and it can result in HIV infection. The next thing is HIV can be found in mucosal secretions. Now, the mucus is very protective and you can find it in a wide variety of places. But in particular, this is where the sexual transmission of HIV becomes an issue. Because you can find HIV in mucosal secretions, that means you can find HIV in vaginal secretions. And that is a mechanism that the virus utilizes. And I don't want to say utilizes as if it's planning, but because the virus is present in immune cells and free virus. So you have viruses associated with cells, and I'll talk about that later. But then you also have viruses that are free, and that can be found in mucosal or vaginal secretions. And that is a means of transmission. But most notably, in addition to blood, HIV can also be found in semen, um, which plays a huge role in obviously sexual intercourse. So that is the main mechanisms of which HIV is transmitted from an HIV infected individual to someone who is not HIV infected. So when HIV comes into contact with an individual, one of the things that it has to do is it has to find a host cell. Now, HIV is very specific, like many other viruses. HIV requires a receptor in order to gain entry into a cell. Think of a receptor as a keyhole. The HIV or HIV has the key, and it needs to float around until it finds the cell that has the appropriate keyhole or receptor that allows it to gain entry into the cell. That receptor is CD4. CD4 is a receptor that is found on the surface of a type of immune cell called T cells, more specifically, helper T cells. Now, I don't want to get into a lot of this, but they don't only require CD4, they also require a co-receptor. And it has been described that the two co-receptors that can be used by HIV, and perhaps addition to others, the literature may suggest more co-receptors, are CCR5, which is the common co-receptor that is used, or CXCR4, which is another co-receptor that can be used. So the virus utilizes both the receptor CD4 or either CCR5 or CXCR4 as co-receptors to gain entry into the cell. This is where things get really interesting. HIV uses that cell to make more of itself, but it does it in a spectacular way. HIV comes in with RNA. Its genetic information is in the form of RNA when it gets into the cell, but it has tools at its disposal that allows it to transform that RNA into DNA in a process known as reverse transcription. It's known as reverse transcription because transcription is the process that DNA goes to RNA. And so now we're talking about RNA going to DNA. That is reverse transcription. This is also really cool. So it takes that DNA, that viral DNA that it has just reverse transcribed from the RNA that it has brought in, and it then plugs it into your DNA. So now at this point, HIV is just as much a part of you as anything else. So as your cell functions and does things that it is normally supposed to do, it is also producing more viral particles. Now, HIV loves, and when I say loves, I mean loves. It is necessary to some degree that that T cell becomes activated. Once that T cell becomes activated, a lot of the machinery that HIV uses to replicate itself becomes available. What makes that so interesting is that a T cell becomes activated when it's doing its normal job. So, when your immune system that the T cell plays a large role in is doing its keeping you safe, that very activity of keeping you safe, being active and thwarting different infections is exactly the environment that the HIV needs in order to replicate and make more of itself. I mean, that's just amazing. It literally attacks your defense at its strongest, most essential point, and it uses your defense against itself to make more of itself. It's amazing. Now, this process actually takes a long time. And as a consequence, individuals who are infected often don't know that they are infected at all. They don't feel sick. There are no symptoms associated with it. In fact, it is estimated that 1 in every 8 HIV positive patients do not, well, I shouldn't say patients, HIV positive individuals don't know that they're positive at all. But what happens over time, this process leads to what is referred to as immune exhaustion. And what happens is over time, CD4 positive T cells are lost. So, your body, everyone's body, has CD4 T cells in it that are moving around doing what they need to do. And someone who's infected with HIV often generally almost 100% of the time, not always, not 100%, but almost 100% of the time, HIV infection leads to the depletion of CD4 positive T cells. That loss of CD4 positive T cells leaves an individual infected with HIV prone and vulnerable to a wide repertoire of opportunistic infections that someone who has an immune system that is intact would not have to worry about. But because CD4 T cells have dipped below a certain threshold, that individual is now vulnerable to a wide array of infections. Once that infection is recognized in a clinic, and it can be a a lot of infections happening at one time in an individual, that person is then in a clinical setting said to have AIDS. AIDS is the late, close to end stage result of HIV infection. Now, someone can be infected with HIV and not have AIDS. That is important to know. So, you might see in movies or so on and so forth where someone's like, oh, you're going to give me AIDS. That's wrong. That is on its face the wrong way to refer to it. Now, you can say, don't give me HIV, or do you have HIV, or have you been tested for HIV? But you're not necessarily tested for AIDS because AIDS is like a disease, a syndrome, right? Where it's described as an individual having the presence of infections that they would normally not have as a consequence of being infected with HIV. So that is so important to really recognize. But now we've talked a little bit about why it's so difficult to deal with, right? One, an HIV positive person doesn't know they're positive. That is so good for the virus. It enhances the likelihood that that individual will engage in sexual intercourse. From an evolutionary standpoint, when somebody is sick, they don't necessarily feel like going out and engaging with other people. They oftentimes don't feel like engaging in sexual activities when they are sick. When you are sick, you are oftentimes working to get better. You are bedridden. You are at home drinking orange juice, eating soup, stuff like that, right? So you're not necessarily out and about looking to engage in sexual activities. In addition to that, from an evolutionary standpoint, we are also trained not to want to engage with people who look sick. So, a person who looks sick is going to be less likely to be engaged with sexually or generally at all. So, that usually works, except for with HIV. HIV is present but not making you sick, which prompts a person to have a false sense of security and confidence in their own status. They engage in sexual activity and they engage in an event or an opportunity or a risky behavior that then presents an opportunity for HIV to spread that way. So that is one of the big problems with HIV. Also, HIV infections can last for a very long time before you develop any of the signs associated with the development of AIDS. Again, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Okay. And so sometimes it can take 7 years, right, before someone even feels anything. And by that time, there's no way that they can associate it with where it came from. They might have had several partners. They might not have known whether the partner that they have been with has been faithful. There's just a lot of complications that are associated with that. So you've got a situation where people are asymptomatic, and symptoms mean you're just displaying something that folks recognize as being associated with sickness. So they're asymptomatic, no symptoms. You also have a situation in which you've got a long period of infection that results in no symptoms at all, that can be multiple years. And so a lot of times people don't really have an appreciation with what their status is because they feel normal for such a long period of time. The next thing is it is infecting the very system that is to keep you healthy. So the very system that is to thwart it, its target. And so that comes with it a lot of problems and ultimately results in the development of AIDS. So that is also a huge problem as well. The next thing is not only is it targeting your immune system, it likes your immune system to be activated, right? So doing what your immune system is supposed to do is the perfect environment for HIV to replicate and be happy and do whatever it needs to do. The next thing is that HIV integrates itself into you, into your DNA. And so it becomes part of you. And that makes it very, very difficult. It has integrated itself into your DNA, into your genome, and that's it, right? It's not just floating around, even though you do have some viruses that are not associated with cells, but the viruses that are integrated and that are actively producing viruses or virions, those are extraordinarily problematic because they are now just as much a part of you as anything else. So it's very, very difficult to treat. And so a lot of times people who are being treated for HIV, they are on regimens for the rest of their life. Now, HIV treatment has gotten so much better. We actually know a lot about other viruses because HIV has been so well studied and we've got so many breakthroughs in regards to HIV. Treatments now that really, if they are adhered to, not only prevent the development of AIDS and allowing people to live long, healthy lives, but they also reduce the likelihood that an HIV infected individual will spread HIV to someone else. So it works so well that there has been a process known as PrEP or pre exposure prophylactics. And that is when an individual it feels that they're engaged in risky behavior or are putting themselves in situations where they could come in contact with HIV, that individual can take drugs that deal with HIV before coming into contact with it, and it prevents them from acquiring the virus that ultimately results in the development of AIDS. So we know a great deal about HIV. And one of the things that I would also like to point out, and I think one of the reasons why it's so problematic, is because HIV has been evolving with us and all of our close relatives, as far as great apes and other primates, for a long time, right? Primates, great apes, humans, we have been in an evolutionary arm race with these retroviruses, for which HIV is, for a very long time. And what has resulted is a virus that is perfectly suited for the environment and for the host that it infects. And so, you know, I really find these topics very, very interesting personally. And you might be thinking, why do I need to know this information? Knowing this information and knowing language associated with viruses and with infection allows you to, one, protect yourself, protect your loved ones. Also, it allows you to have appropriate expectations when you're dealing with things like vaccines or treatments, because you are not necessarily working to deal with the virus, you are working to deal with the disease. And those are two entirely different things. And so, hopefully, you were able today, in today's episode, to learn a little bit more about viruses, the virus that I worked on, which is HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. It has been an absolute joy, pleasure, honor, and privilege to be with you again today. Again, remember that the Richard Watkins Podcast is a proud production of the Science Policy Action Network. I am your humble host, Dr. Richard Watkins. And more importantly, remember that the future is not something to wait for, but it is something to build. Until next time, take care.